Hello everyone and a warm welcome to this morning's webinar, which is Corrections Over Year End at Sage 50 Payroll. Today's session is one of the webinars that we're doing as a kind of spin-off series to Payroll Year End. So we do have our main Payroll Year End webinars, which is parts 1 and 2, with a few dates and times left for each of those if you've not seen them yet. And then in the other sessions, we talk about some common topics over Payroll Year End. It's not just corrections either, things like directors' national insurance, starters and leavers, etc. So stay tuned until the end and I'll let you know what else we've got coming up too. But my name's Alice, I'm your host and presenter for the session. I'm also joined by some of my amazing colleagues in the background. They're going to be hard at work answering your questions in the Q&A throughout the session too. And a little look at what we'll be covering today too. So I will begin with an introduction to corrections. So some of the different options that you've got if you do discover that you need to make a correction. And speaking of those options, we then talk about the restore feature. We've also got the recovery option as well, or rolling back. So different ways that you can correct a mistake there. We'll then move on to submitting the HMRC, so how to inform them of the corrections that you've made and any differences to the original FPS, for example. And then some other things to consider, so adjusting your employees' pay, plus a few more pieces of advice too. Now I do include things about payroll year end and kind of corrections over year end throughout the webinar, but I do also have some common questions that we get asked around corrections at year end. So I've got its own section for that and kind of go through some of those common questions and how you would fix them as well. And then as usual, we will finish with some further support and of course be answering your questions throughout the session too. So that's what we're covering. And let's go ahead and begin with that introduction then. So we're going to start with some examples of things that can go wrong. There obviously are more things that can go wrong than what I've got here, but these are just some common mistakes that people do end up needing to correct in payroll. And this webinar should just help to give you some confidence to know what to do and how to fix certain situations. So just some examples, you might have over or underpaid somebody. Maybe you've got statutory payment errors, so that's not the right amount that they've been paid. Maybe you've put the wrong process date in payroll, so you've paid your employees on the wrong pay date. Or you've forgot to apply a tax code change or a change of NI category, so you've ended up processing the employee on the wrong one. That's also a common mistake there. Or pension errors, so maybe someone's on the wrong scheme or their contributions weren't correct. So as I said, there's definitely more, but these are just a few common examples and scenarios there. And in this webinar, we're going to focus on ways that you can put these right. So two main options for this. The first one is being to correct the error in the next pay run. So let's say you've had a small over or underpayment for an employee. You might just choose to adjust the next payments that you give them to accommodate for this. What this means is no payroll history has changed, and that correction is then carried forward to the next pay period and done there. This option also means that you won't need to do any manual adjustments. You won't need to submit any adjustments to HMRC. But you will of course have to wait a little bit longer, as this mistake is instead corrected in the next pay run, so you aren't able to rectify it with the employee kind of there and then. So that's the first option you've got. Now the next approach, which we are going to focus on in today's webinar, is reprocessing your payroll. So this option does involve going back to the original period where the mistake happened, and then entering the corrected pay values from there and reprocessing back up to date again. So that is one important thing there to bear in mind. You would also need to reprocess any other periods between the mistakes date and your current pay date to kind of bring the payroll back up to date again. Then once you've completed the correction, you would then go and submit an FPS adjustment to HMRC, which we'll cover later in the webinar, and a few other things to consider too, which again we'll talk about a bit later on. Now, if you do decide to go back and reprocess, as this often is the better option, just a few things to consider with this. So before the correction, you need to make sure that you've got the original information. So this is things like the original payslip for the employee. So you've got something to compare to there. The P32 report, especially if you've got any statutory payments or you've paid HMRC, you've made that payment. And also the record of any pension payments that you've made or nominal linked transactions as well, if that is something that you use. You'll also need to consider what you've done since. So this could be more payment periods that you've processed since the mistake. You might have people on different payment frequencies, because remember, you will have to process the payroll back up to date again. And this could be for one employee, a few employees or all of your employees. It does depend on the mistake that you're correcting and the method that you're using to correct it. Now, since we're almost at year end as well, this time of year, you also need to consider whether the mistake was in a previous tax year. If it was, very similar concept of how you're going to correct the mistakes, but just a few different things to consider, which we will talk about as we go on. You then need to consider how you're going to make the correction. So we do have different options in payroll. Are you going to restore or recover a backup that you've taken? Or are you going to use the rollback wizard? Now, whichever of these that you use, you will then have to enter the corrected values and make the correction itself. So you'll set the process date correctly to the date, to the pay date that you're correcting, amend any information that you need, and then reprocess again. And as I say, you'll do that for each period from the pay date that you went back to. And then afterwards, you will need to adjust your employees' pay if there has been any difference there, adjust any HMRC payments that you've made, which are now different, submit the adjustments to HMRC in an FPS adjustment if you need to, and then also think about some other things, as I said, like pensions, nominal link, etc. So we will try and touch on this as much as we can throughout the session on all of those different points. We are going to focus on the rollback option today, but before we talk about rolling back, I do want to start with a little bit on restoring and recovering backups too. So each of these are different ways that you can go back to the mistake. And for those of you who've seen our webinars before, you know that we always advise to take backups of your data. You are prompted to at particular points in your pay run. And this means that you've got your data backed up should it ever get damaged, corrupted or lost. It also means that you do have a backup that you can go back to make a correction. So you can take your own backups either when you're prompted to or by going to File and Backup in Payroll. And these backups that you've taken can be restored into Payroll. So you can restore your own backups. The other option that you've got is recovering an automatic backup taken by Payroll. So these automatic backups are taken as you update the records, and these are ideal if you forgot to take your own backup or you might have lost it. So recovering is for automatic backups. Now, whether you restore or recover a backup, that's going to overwrite any existing data with the backup's data. So this is why it's important to take a backup before you do these processes. So essentially you've taken a step back in time, and that backup's data, it's going to overwrite the existing data. And when to use these options as well. So you might restore or recover a backup for recent mistakes. So if you've just updated the records and then realised that you forgot to add a certain payment, for example. And these options are also better suited to mistakes which affect a lot or all of your employees. So since it does overwrite the payroll data with the backup data, just to be very clear here, the restore and recover options do affect all of your employees. So even if you're not correcting them all, it will take them all back to that point that you're going back to. And I will be showing you, these options in the programme shortly. I do want to kind of walk you through the restore and recover wizards. But an important thing to note before we do is that restoring a backup, when you are in that restore wizard, you do have a page where you've got the option to select the file types that you'd like to restore. Now, depending on what you're selecting here, the backup that's restored will overwrite those selected file types. Ordinarily, this is just the data files only that will need to be restored to fix the mistake. Data files includes your basic data, so you've got your payment information, company information and things too. Something I do want to point out though are the RTI files. So this is your real-time information data, so your FPSs, EPSs and things like that. This should only be selected in very specific circumstances. If you are instructed by our technical support team, for example. The reason why you don't just randomly select RTI files is because if you did and then you'd corrected a mistake, Payroll will no longer know that the FPS has been sent for those periods because it's removed that data there. And it will allow you to send another full FPS. So essentially that's duplicating your liabilities and your figures to HMRC for that pay period. And this probably will result in HMRC expecting you to pay a much higher liability than you're meant to, which I'm assuming nobody wants to do. So moral of the story, if you are restoring a backup, very important to only select data files unless you're otherwise instructed to select any of the others. So let's just go straight into payroll. We'll take a closer look at each of these options. And I just want to set the scene with these demos as well. So in today's demonstrations, I have already processed my last pay run of the 24-25 tax year. I've already completed payroll year end. And just to be able to show you some different scenarios, I have already processed April too. So I know that is a little bit in the future, but it just allows me to show you some more scenarios today. I've got a monthly payroll. And as we can see, my last updated and last FPS date is the 30th of April. So that was my April pay date. Now, in this scenario, I've looked at my reports and I've actually realised that I've made a mistake. So I've actually missed off a payment for most of my employees in the new tax year, so in the April pay date. Now, since this affects most of my employees and it's a recent mistake, one of the options I've got, I could decide to restore a pre-update backup from April and reprocess that period. And what the restore route will allow me to do is go back in time, correct those payments for the employees, and then kind of re-update and reprocess April again. Now, when I do payroll, I do tend to take 2 backups per pay run. So I've got a pre-update and a post-update backup for each period. Here's just a few examples of them. Feel free to take more. It's always better to be safe than sorry, but this way I've got 2 backups should I ever need to restore and go back to one of those places. It is also helpful to name them appropriately as well. So you can see I've got like month 10, pre and post update, month 11, pre-post update, etc. And I've then got April's backups just down here. So month 1, 25-26, pre-update and post update. So I would be able to go and restore one of these now, just to go back to correct this mistake. And to do this, I'm going to go to File and Restore. And this is going to bring up the Restore wizard. So this first page does have some recent backups that have been taken. If the one that you need is here, by all means select it. But if it's not, you can leave this page blank and then just click Next. And then this is that all-important window, so you do need to make sure that you've only got data files selected, unless you've been told otherwise. So I'll click Next again. And I can now browse to the file, to that backup file that I need, as I know exactly where it is and what it's called. So if I just go to my folder there, and I'm just going to restore that pre-update backup for April, which will allow me to go back and edit those payments. So I'll open that file there and I will click Next. A little bit more information about the restore wizard there. So just saying that it's going to overwrite the overwrite the data as well. But we'll click Finish and Payroll will go through and restore that data. Now, something else it will do, it will prompt you to enter your password again. And this also gives you the opportunity to make sure that the process date is the date that you're going to go back to and correct. So that's correct for mine. And then we'll log in as normal. And that is the backup restored. So the restore wizard is telling Payroll that we want to overwrite the data files from the moment in time that that backup was taken. And we can see it's changed my last updated date to the 31st of March, as we're now prior to April's records being updated. Now do notice my last FPS date is still the 30th of April. That is exactly what we want. So I do not need to send another normal FPS, as I say, that would duplicate the liabilities for the period. What I'll need to do instead is send an FPS adjustment once all the corrections are done, and I'll come back to that later. But after I've restored the backup, it would just be a case of reprocessing the employees correctly this time. Remember, that's all of the employees, as the restore affects everyone. So I would go into enter payments as normal. I'd correct the mistake with that missed payment, and I would do any other pre-update tasks that I need, so pre-update reports, new pay slips, etc. And then I would go ahead and update the records to bring my payroll back up to date. Now, I'm not going to reprocess in any detail just yet. I will be a little bit later, but I did just want to show you how you would restore a backup if you did pick that option. But I'm now going to go back to File and Restore. I'm just going to restore myself back up to date again, because I also want to show you the recover option. So if I just go back to my post-update April backup, so completely back up to date again, click Next and Finish. Enter my password there. And notice the last updated date changed, so I'm now back up to date. And I do want to show you the recover option too. So remember, the recover wizard is a way of going back to an automatic backup that the payroll itself took as you were about to update the records. You can get to this by going to File and Recover, so just below the restore option there. And again, it does prompt you to take a backup if you don't have one. I absolutely would. It does strongly recommend that you take one. I do already have one though, as you've seen, so I'll click next. And this is a little bit all over the place just with me preparing for this webinar. Yours will look quite different to this. But the point of this is you can see the processing period, you can see the pay date or the process date for the periods that you've already updated. Payment frequencies, so I've got M for monthly, and the date and time that the backup was created. So this allows you to see all of the information of periods that have been updated, and it would just be a case of selecting the earliest pay date that you want to go back to. So yours would probably say like tax month 1, 2, 3, etc. for the current tax year with the different pay dates that you've processed on. You'd select the earliest one that you want to go back to, and you click next and finish. A little bit of information of what to do after you recover as well. But I will just cancel out of that process for now. The recover option is great though if you can't find the backup that you need or you forgot to take one. And same as the restore option, what it would do is change your last updated date to allow you to make the corrections for that period. And then of course reprocess the payroll back up to date again. But again, it would not change the last FPS date. Instead, you would need to send an FPS adjustment. So that was how to restore or recover. Those options are more suitable for mistakes that affect all or most of your employees. Remember, only restore data files unless you're otherwise instructed. But I do want to move on to the rollback option now. So this is different to restoring or recovering. And rather than overwriting all of the payroll data for all of the employees, the rollback option instead removes the payment history for one or more selected employees. So it only affects the employees that are selected in the rollback process to have their payment history removed. And as you can see on that screenshot on the right, you can choose the pay period to roll back to, and then of course reprocess from there. So this is best to use for mistakes that affect one or a few employees when you need to reprocess any earlier periods. Maybe you don't have a backup available or you only need to correct one person. The beauty of the rollback is that when it does come to correcting the mistakes, you only need to correct and reprocess the employees that you rolled back, as I say. So with that though, do bear in mind, you would only be able to reproduce the pre-update reports for the employees that you rolled back, as everyone else would still remain up to date. And a little top tip too, especially around this time of year, if you do need to roll back to a previous tax year, which we will be shortly, you do need to roll back the current tax year first. So you kind of do the rollback in two different chunks. So speaking of that, we are going to go back to the demo. I do want to look at that rollback option, and I do have a scenario that I need to fix. So I'm back in payroll. I do have an employee that I need to make amendments to. And for this scenario, I need to go back a few months to fix it. I actually need to go back to February. And if I just explain what the correction is, so I'll open up the record. And just on the right-hand side here, I can see that this employee has hit state retirement age. They actually hit that age a few months ago in February. And I did get messages to change their NI category. So when I clicked save, for example, it does let me know that I need to change them. In this case to NI category C, but for whatever reason, I just didn't. So if I just check the history tab, yeah, I can see they have been processed on the wrong NI category up until April. This has been wrong since the birthday, and it should have been changed to C at that point. So how am I going to correct this? Well, I'm going to roll back this employee for those months where the NI category was incorrect. And before I do that, I will make sure that I've got a backup of my data. And I also will make sure that I've got the original information of what's been paid to hand. So this is things like the employee's payslip. So it's a really good idea to have that to compare to once you've made the correction. And also the P32 report for the payment to HMRC as well. Now, if you don't have the payslip, you can actually reproduce the payslips from the payroll links section. So if I just click on that, in this case, I'm going to grab the payslips from each of the periods I'm going to reprocess. So February to April. So you can kind of cross tax years with this as well. I'll click OK. And this gives you all of the different payslip layouts that you would normally have. And it's just a way of reproducing them after you've updated the records. So you're still able to get them. And if I just produce them here, just wait for them to load up. Here we can see I've got February's, March's and April's payslip for the employee. So I'll be able to see obviously they're still paying national insurance there, and then once I change that category, they won't be anymore, so I can see the differences there. So that was just reprinting pay slips from the payroll links section. So now it's time to actually do that rollback. I'm just going to make sure I've highlighted the employee or employees that I'm rolling back. And at this time, I'm going to go to tasks. And then about halfway down, you've got the rollback option. Again, you do have the option to take a backup here. A little bit more information on the rollback wizard as well. But I'm going to go and click next. Please double check you've got the right person highlighted here as well. If anyone else is there who's not meant to be, cancel out of the process, and then of course come back to it once you've selected the right people. Click next, and then you do have the, all of the different periods that you've got here, where you'd be able to select the earliest pay period that you want to remove. Now, of course, in this tax year, I've only processed April, so I can only see April. And if I was only going back one period to correct something, I would just select that period there, and then click next and finish to finish the rollback and make that correction. But as I say, because we are going back a few months to fix this mistake, and I need to go back to a previous tax year, we do have to do that rollback in 2 chunks. So first of all, I need to roll back any periods in the current tax year, so that is April in my case. I will click next and finish. And since we are rolling back the earliest period in the tax year here, it does bring up this message, just asking if I want to remove the following information. So this is lots of different year-to-dates for the employee. Be very careful with this message if it comes up for you. I would get into the habit of just making sure that you don't whiz through the rollback process, just in case you miss something like this and then end up clicking the wrong thing. So I do not want to remove these year-to-dates for the employee. I'm going to click no in this scenario. And once I have, that process is complete. I'll click OK, and I can see the employee's been rolled back for April. So that is the first chunk of the rollback done, but we do still need to get back to last tax year. So to do this, I'm going to change my process date to last tax year. I'm actually just going to change it to the earliest period that I'm correcting, which in my case is February, just so I'm prepared. And now that payroll is in that last tax year, I'm going to go back to tasks and back to rollback. And this is that second chunk of the rollback that we need to do. So I'll click next. Again, check the right employees there. Click next again, and this is more like what you'll see. So you've got all of the different periods that you've processed. We're going to select the earliest one. So I need to reprocess from Feb. So I need to do Feb, March, and then of course April, the new tax year. I'll click next and I'll click finish. And that is the process complete. So notice now the employee's last updated date has changed to the 31st of January. So at this point, what I'm going to do is then correct that mistake. So I'm going to go into the employee's record, and I'm going to go to the employment tab and change their NI category. I'll change this to C. This should have been changed obviously in Feb, so that's what we're doing now. And just save the record. Perfect. So that is it. That's it now correct. But of course, I do need to get this employee re-updated again and back up to date. So back up to April again. I don't need to manually change their pay. There's nothing actually changing with their salary. But I am going to open up Enter Payments because I do need payroll to kind of recalculate with that new NI category. So we can see they've now got no NI contributions there for them, and their net pay has increased slightly too. So I'll just save that and click Close. After this, it would just be a case of completing any other pre-update tasks that you normally would. So if you run the pension assessment for them, if you have any pre-update reports, but do remember you will only be able to produce these for the employee or employees that you've rolled back. Also produce a new payslip for them if you upload the payslips. But for today, just because there is a lot to get through, I'm just going to skip ahead to update the records for Feb. So we'll just go through that process. Of course, if you do want to take a backup there, you've got the option. Then I'll click next, next, and finish. And that is them done. So that is February back up to date again. We don't need to send an FPS adjustment at this point. What we'll do is we'll wait until all of the corrections are done for that. So at this point, I just need to change my process date to the next pay date that I'm reprocessing, which for me is the March pay date, 31st of March. And then it's just the same process again. So you check Enter Payments, I just want to recalculate there with that NI category, just double check the payments in there. Any other pre-update tasks that I need, and then of course update the records. So reprocessing March, click finish, and click OK. There we go, so 31st of March again for the last updated date. So for the previous tax year, 2024-25, these corrections are done. If I just open up the employee, I just want to show you the history tab again. Perfect, so I can see from the birthday, they've now been processed on the correct NI category with that slightly increased net pay too. Now this is where corrections are a little bit different across 2 tax years, because I need to inform HMRC of the adjustments in the 24-25 tax year before I can update April of 25-26 and bring this employee completely back up to date again. So similar to how we rolled back in 2 chunks, we also have to make that correction and submit to HMRC in 2 chunks as well. So what I'll do at this point, I'm just going to pause the correction for now. We're going to go back to the slides and just talk about submitting to HMRC, and then we'll come back to the demo and get them all updated and everything submitted to HMRC. So just a little recap there. So we did choose who to roll back to. We used the wizard to choose that period, and we went back to February. And this option is better for mistakes that affect one or a small number of employees, as everyone else is left untouched. Now do remember, if you are rolling back to a previous tax year, you first have to roll back anything in the current tax year. But on to submitting to HMRC, there are 2 submissions that I would like to talk about today. The first one is an FPS adjustment. So you might have heard of this before, but the FPS adjustment is submitted to HMRC to inform them of the difference between the original FPS and the corrected values. And it's submitted once the correction is complete and payroll is completely back up to date again. So this is a submission for the current tax year. If you were submitting multiple pay periods as well, you would just send one FPS adjustment, and that would include differences for all of the periods that you've reprocessed. And just a note, if you are correcting more than one period, the liability adjustment in the submission window will only show the difference for the most recent period only, not the previous, but it does still include those previous periods included in the submission as year-to-date values, so just bear that in mind. So I will show you how to submit an FPS adjustment, of course, once we're all up to date again and April is reprocessed too. But where I am right now in the demo, the other submission that I need to do to inform them of the previous tax year is actually just called amend a previous tax year. That is an option in Payroll. Now this submission is very similar to the FPS adjustment. It still shows the difference between the original FPS and then the corrected values. But this submission, as I said, is for a previous tax year. And you can use this option to submit amendments for the 2 previous tax years. It is important to submit the amendment before you start reprocessing in the current tax year, hence why we've paused the demo for now. And same thing with the liability adjustment. As I mentioned with the FPS adjustment, it will include all of the values for all of the periods that we've updated, but it will only show the most recent one. So let's go ahead and get this amendment submitted to HMRC as we are in the position to do so. Back in Payroll, and the first thing that I need to do to submit this one is change my process date to the 5th of April 2025, so the last day of the previous tax year. Perfect. And now to submit this amended previous tax year submission, I'm going to go to e-submissions, and you'll see you do have the option there. So I'll just go ahead and click on this. So notice it does say full payment submission adjustment or FPS adjustment. It is basically an FPS adjustment, but just for the previous tax year. So I'll click continue, double check these company details here and click submit. And then it will show you the information for the employee. So we're only submitting it for one employee. We can see that confirmed there. And we can see that confirmation of the liability adjustment for the corrections that we've made. So I'll go ahead and click submit and get this sent to HMRC. So once this submission is complete, you do have the option of printing this if you do want to see the submission log and kind of keep record of this. You will also be able to see it in your e-submissions log, similar as to how you would with all of the submissions that you make. But at this point, HMRC have been informed of the adjustments to the previous tax year. So I'm going to now go back to payroll and change my process date to the next period that I'm correcting. So that's my April pay date, 30th of April. So I can bring this employee completely back up to date again. So remember, I changed the NI category to C. So all I want to do is go to enter payments and just double check those payment values there, which are all correct. Same again, so any other pre-update tasks I need, and then it would be a case of updating the records. And click next. Because it is the first period of the tax year, you do get some extra reminders there. That is completely normal. And we'll click next and finish. Perfect. So we can see now the last updated and last FPS date are now matching. And that is all my adjustments done. So we're all up to date again. And at this point, we do need to inform HMRC of the amendments that we've made in the current tax year. So just checking the last updated date and last FPS date, obviously they are matching. That is a good indicator that you're ready for the FPS adjustment. So again, highlight the employee or employees that you need to send it for. And you've got the FPS adjustment in a few different places. You do have it in your payroll tasks, just below the FPS. It's also in your e-submissions as well. So we'll just go ahead and click FPS adjustment there. And this pretty much looks identical to the one that we've just submitted for the previous tax year. So again, just click continue, double check all of your details in here, click submit. Of course, view that information there, confirming that this is only for one employee today, and then we'll click submit. So remember, although we did correct multiple pay periods, we only need to submit one FPS adjustment for the current tax year once all of the corrections are made. So this does include year-to-date values reflecting all of the historical periods in the current tax year that we might have changed. And again, if you do want to view these submissions that you've made, just double check the e-submissions log. But that was the FPS adjustment. And just a reminder here as well of the amend a previous tax year submission, which is for the previous tax year. If you do need to submit this, just remember it's once all of your corrections in the previous tax year are done. You'll change your process date to the 5th of April of the relevant tax year. You can do it for the last two if you need to. And then you'll go to e-submissions and amend a previous tax year and just work through that submission. And it will look very similar to an FPS adjustment. But now that that is done, that is everything that we need to do to correct the payroll. So I'm just going to move on to one of the last shorter sections of the webinar, which is adjusting your employees' pay and just a bit of advice on any other adjustments that you might need to do. So again, this is mainly just some advice. Each company might do these differently, more of a reminder of things that you might need to consider. So first thing that you would need to consider are changes to the net pay. So I have mentioned this a couple of times, but it's a good idea to compare the old payslip with the new payslip just to see any differences there. So here I've got screenshots of payslips from the employee, mainly just showing the difference to the NI contribution since we corrected the NI category. So take one from the other and you can work out how much more you need to pay the employee or how much you need to deduct from them as a result of the corrections. Now there are a few different options of how to pay them. You could do it outside of payroll if you're happy to, or if you do want to include it on the next payslip, you could use a post-tax, post-NI payment to pay that in the next period. Or if you've got an overpayment, you can arrange to make deductions from your employee, again outside of payroll, or same again, you can put that through payroll. I do have a really helpful article on this slide, so just be sure to get the handout downloaded. This does explain pre and post tax and NI payment pay elements, how to set them up and when to use them and things like that, so really helpful there. Something else to consider is HMRC payments, or similar thing. You'll check your original P32 report, which will show what you originally paid them, against the new P32 report for the payment periods that you've corrected. Compare the total amounts due on line 21 of the report, and if you owe HMRC money, you'd add that onto your next payment, or if you've paid them too much, you would deduct that from your next payment. So that's generally how it's done if you are amending payments to HMRC. But if you do have any questions or queries regarding the amendments to what you've paid them, it will be HMRC themselves that you can contact for further support with that. Another thing to bear in mind with this as well are the recovery values for things like your statutory payments, so your maternity pay, etc. Of course, you can check that on the P32. And if these have been changed or there are changes to them because of the corrections that you've made, you will also need to send a new EPS, so that's an employer payment summary, to report those changes and give HMRC the updated year-to-date values too. That's something else to consider there. As well as pensions, a lot of variety with this one. There are so many ways that you can submit and upload pension information. Of course, loads of different pension providers as well. So with this, if there have been any changes, again, I would advise just checking the original pension information that you might have on reports with the new information, and then contact your pension provider just for advice on how they would advise you to submit the differences that there might be. I know there are a few pension providers where you can manually amend the contributions on your pension provider portal, for example, but again, that's not for everyone, so it's always best to just double check with your provider. And then lastly, for any of you that use nominal link to post over to accounts, if you do reprocess an earlier period, you will be prompted to send those postings again. If you don't, you will end up with an error message saying that you've got incomplete postings. Of course, that does kind of double up what you're posting though for the employees. So a few different options with this one. You can either post them again and then reverse the original journals in accounts, or you can post a file and then make manual adjustments to the existing postings that are already in accounts. So it might be worth just checking how your company would prefer to do this, but yeah, there are options to get this kind of sorted out on the account side of things. So just wanted to kind of advise you there. But as I say, these can be done differently depending on your company. But that does bring us on to the last section of the webinar. So of course, I have been talking about some kind of things to do with year end throughout the webinar, but I do have some common questions and scenarios around corrections over year end. So I do want to talk about these and explain what you would do in each scenario. So question number one that I've got for you, we do get asked this a lot. So do you have to rerun payroll year end after you've made a correction? And the answer to this is no, you don't. So you don't have to do those steps again, but you can replace the P60s if you'd like to. Something I would check though, was the correction made before or after the 19th of April? This is the final, the deadline for the final submission to HMRC that you would have done in the year end process. And depending on the date, this ultimately decides how you inform HMRC of the corrections that you've made since running year end. So just to be clear, you do not need to resubmit that final EPS that you did in the year end steps. Now, if the correction was made before the 19th of April, you can send an FPS adjustment to HMRC with the changes that the corrections caused. Alternatively, if the correction was made after the 19th of April, it would instead be the amended previous tax year submission, as it's now technically for the previous tax year. So just bear that in mind. Something else to consider though are the employees' P60s. So in most cases, you will have already issued these, but if you haven't, just issue those when you're ready, and they'll of course include those corrections that you've made. But if you have already given the P60s, whoever you made changes to will now have an incorrect P60. So you can replace the P60s. HMRC don't say anything about you not being able to. If you've uploaded them to Sage HR, for example, I would just simply re-upload the P60, and what that will do is replace the now incorrect one with the correct one. Something else to point out though, HMRC guidance also brings up a good point about the employee's personal tax account. So if there has been a correction made by you, the employer, and then you've resubmitted to HMRC with the FPS adjustment, the personal tax account will reflect those corrections too. So just bear that in mind. They could log in and see those corrections themselves as well. So no, you don't have to rerun year end, but you do need to consider things like informing HMRC of the corrections, as we've spoke about during the webinar, and the P60s as well, if you've already issued them. That is a question we do get asked quite a lot. Next question that I've got for you. So this is to do with the employer payment summaries. So how do I correct an EPS that I sent last tax year? Or what if I forgot to send my EPS? So the good thing about the EPS is if you do forget to submit it, or you've made corrections since sending one, you can submit a new EPS, which will provide HMRC with the updated year-to-date values. Now, since it has year-to-date values, any previous periods in the tax year, including any that you might have forgotten to submit for and missed, they will also be included. So it will send all of the year-to-date values kind of up to and including the month that you're sending for. So let's say you got to the new tax year and then you realised that you hadn't sent anything for the previous tax year when you needed to in terms of the EPS. You can send an EPS for a previous tax year, and it's very simple to do so. So all you need to do is change your process date to the 5th of April of the relevant tax year, and then just submit the EPS as you would normally, so just from your e-submissions to tasks. I have linked more information on corrections to EPSs as well, and what to do if you've forgotten at the bottom of this slide. So loads of really great articles on the EPS on the Help Centre. It looks like we do only have time for one more scenario, so next one that I've got for you before we kind of wrap things up. So question number 3 here, this is what do I do if I've accidentally processed a leaver without updating their final pay? So first thing to consider with this one is, have you already sent the FPS for the employee? If you haven't, this means that HMRC haven't been informed of the leaver yet, so you can just remove the leave date from their employee record and then go ahead to process that final pay, update the records, and then make them a leaver again. And then when you submit the FPS for them, that's when HMRC are informed of that final pay for the employee and of course that they've left. Now, if you have sent the FPS, HMRC are of course aware of that leaver now. Little tip as well, just to check the last FPS date for the employee. If this date is the same date as the missing payment, which would be the case if you've sent the FPS after the leaver wizard was run, it will just be the same steps as before. So remove the leave date, process that final pay, update the records and make them a leaver again. But this time, instead of an FPS, since you've already sent one, it will be an FPS adjustment that's needed. Something important to mention here as well is the P45 for the employee. So if you have already produced the P45 for the employee, it sounds extreme, but you must destroy this before you can produce a corrected one for them. So very important here, an employee cannot have more than one P45 as per HMRC. So there's lots of different scenarios that we get over year end, especially around starters and leavers as well. We don't have time to go through all of them today, but I just want to let you know we are running a few sessions on starters and leavers, which I'll tell you all about in the further support very shortly. I wish we had time to go through more scenarios like this, but unfortunately we don't have time in today's sessions. I can see though the Q&A has been busy, so hopefully if you did have any other queries or questions, you have been able to get the answers that you need from my colleagues there. If you do have any more questions, we will stick around to answer a couple more until we kind of end the webinar. And don't forget to check out the extra support links that we've included on the slides as well. So just get the handout downloaded, and if you get the digital one, you will be able to kind of click to the different links that we've put on the slides too. But that does bring us to the end of the content today. So as I say, before I end the webinar, I do just want to make you aware of some further support that we've got available to you. And first thing is webinars. So in case you missed it, we do have the part 1 and part 2 of the Payroll Year End webinars. So part 1, we go through the installation of the new update and preparing for year end itself. And then part 2, obviously processing payroll year end, getting ready for the new tax year and going over any new legislation, things like that. And as I mentioned at the start, we are also doing more sessions this year on certain topics. So of course, you've attended corrections today. We do have starters and leavers, directors national insurance, and online pay slips and P60s too. We do also have the next HR advice webinar. So we are joined by some very special guests from Advisor Plus for these. And they do kind of focus on different topics in each session. They are real experts when it comes to HR. So if you do deal with HR in your company, I would highly recommend getting yourself along to that webinar. So you can sign up for them at sage.co.uk/webinars. Or if you download the handout, just click that register now button. Something else to be aware of is our help centre, so that's sage.co.uk/help. You can access loads of support guides here, search for anything that you need a bit of help with. There's demonstration videos. We do have a webinar section with all of the recordings of our previous webinars. And if you do need to get in contact with us for any reason, if you need technical support, we do have those contact options too. And then last thing is Sage University. So this is sageu.com. Here you can set up a free account. You can access e-learning courses, bite-sized learning as well, and earn certification for any training that you get done on there. It's really great if you just want to expand your knowledge on Sage 50 Payroll, or if you've got any other Sage products with us. It's not just Sage 50 Payroll that we have training for, so that is a really great option there. But it does look like we're just about out of time here. If you are leaving us now, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you've learned something new. And yeah, thank you for your time. One last ask from me though is you will see a short survey as you exit the webinar. So if you do have just a moment to fill that out, I would really, really appreciate that. We do read all of the comments that you leave and take a look at all of the scores and just try to improve these webinars all the time. So thank you in advance for that. I can still see there are some questions in the Q&A though, so I'm aware we're kind of out of time now, but I'm happy to stay a little bit longer and get those answered. So what I'll do, I'll go on mute for a few minutes, kind of get up to date with those questions and answer as many as we can, and then I will come back to kind of wrap things up and say goodbye. So yeah, I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Hello everyone, that's just me back again. It does look like we've answered most of the questions. I think there's just a couple of the guys just getting the last answers out. So thank you so much for keeping them so busy during the session, and hopefully you found those answers useful. As I said, do feel free to copy and paste any that you need. But that is it from us today, so thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and we would love to see you on some more webinars in the future. We've got loads coming up over Payroll year end. So yeah, we'll see you for then, and other than that, it is goodbye for now.